Elmendorf, for coming before the committee today. It's nice to have you back, and congratulations on your reappointment for a full term. I first wanted to start off by saying how tough a job we know Congressional Budget Office and the employees have. We're going to work pretty hard in the year to come. We appreciate the professionalism, the expertise that you have brought to the job. Everybody brings to this job a background and a perspective and a point of view. And the best CBO directors, whether it was Orzag or Holtz-Eaton, check it at the door, and you've done a very good job of doing that, of sticking down the middle of the fairway, and I just want to commend you for that. We'll have probably differences of opinions on methodology and things like that from time to time, but I enjoy the rigor of our debate, and I enjoy the fact that we can have a great exchange of ideas. And I also want to just simply start off by saying I think it's great that you do more consulting with outside academics and outside forecasters, because we don't have all the wisdom here, and it's important that you do that consultation. So I want to commend you for that and welcome you to a full 4-year term. With that, I just got your report. We got this the other day, and it's deteriorated. Our baseline is going in the wrong direction. And these problems we have, let me first start off by saying it's not all the Democrats' party's fault. It's not all the Republicans' fault. Both parties are responsible for where we are today. I would argue that the most recent history, I think our fiscal policy went in the wrong direction. But finger pointing doesn't solve problems. Solutions solve problems. And we will have a difference of opinion on how to solve problems. And we do disagree with how to solve problems, but we don't disagree on where we want to go. We want people to have jobs in America. We want to have prosperity. We want to have an opportunity society. We want to leave our kids and our grandkids with a country that is better off with a higher standard of living. And what is interesting about this and previous reports that you've been giving us is we know without a shadow of doubt we're giving the next generation a lower standard of living. And what amazes me is when you do your long-run modeling that your model actually ends up shutting down by the time our kids are in our age bracket, because the CBO can't conceive of a point in which the economy can continue because of the debt burdens that are being placed upon it. So we have a moral imperative in this committee to get this right, to stop pointing fingers, to stop turning reforms into political weapons to be used in the next campaign, and to actually buckle down and get this. Now, what is so important right now is the economy, is job creation, is prosperity. Your latest report reminds us that between June of 2009, when the recession technically ended, and last December, payroll employment rose by a mere 0.06%, 0.06%. You compare that to the same period of time following past recessions. During those recoveries, employment rose by an average of 4.4%. Unemployment is too high because job growth is too low. And job growth is too low because, in my opinion, contrary to conventional wisdom here in Washington, we cannot tax, borrow, and spend our way to a prosperous future. The deficit's $1.5 trillion. The publicly held debt is up to 69% of GDP. It was at 40% by the end of 2008. And if you take a look at the alternative fiscal scenario, which I believe, and I think most people would argue, is the more accurate reading of where we're headed, it's downright scary. And so we believe that the prosperity plan is real spending controls, spending cuts, and reforms, along with pro-growth economic policies for job creation. We can't create jobs in Washington. That's what the private sector does. And if we try to borrow and spend more money to create jobs in Washington, that ends up taking money from the private sector, propping up our debt, putting pressure on interest rates, because current big deficits is nothing more than tomorrow's big tax increases. That produces more uncertainty for businesses. So we just respectfully will probably disagree on how to create jobs, on how to get to prosperity. But let's just make sure that we all understand we want the same objective. We want our constituents to work. We want our kids and our grandkids to do better off. You're going to be overburdened with lots of requests. We really appreciate the way in which you respond with speed to our requests, and we hope you do so as well with other members. But we've got to get serious about this problem. And hopefully we can do a fairly quick turnaround on the president's budget, which is a little late. That's because Jack Lew was appointed late. But hopefully you can get us a pretty good turnaround on the president's budget. There's one more thing I would simply say is we want to be asking you to do some more runs on interest rate simulations, on healthcare assumption simulations. And with that, I just want to yield to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Chairman Ryan, and I want to join my friend and colleague Paul Ryan in congratulating you, Dr. Elmendorf, on being reappointed. As the chairman indicated, there's sometimes we like the CBO numbers and projections on one side or the other. Sometimes we don't. But the reality is, I think we agree that you and your team have been an incredibly professional organization. You call them as you see them. And I do believe, and I think we would agree on this, that when it comes to the budget process here in Congress, at the end of the day, we have to have some common measure of where we are on these different indicators, and that if we were to throw out the CBO numbers, whether we sometimes agree with them or not, it would be a recipe for budget and fiscal chaos. Let me just talk about some of those numbers, because as the chairman indicated, we probably do have different perspectives on exactly how we got here, but I think we do share a common interest. I know we share a common interest in trying to find a way out toward a fiscally sustainable future for this country. But I do think it's important, in light of the projections you've got, just to remind the members of the committee that 2 years ago, the economy was in free fall. I mean, that's what the facts state. We were losing, we were at a negative 6% growth rate, losing 700,000 jobs a month. Yesterday in his testimony, Dr. Bernanke indicated that a combination of factors, including the recovery bill, actions by the Federal Reserve, and efforts to rescue the financial system, helped prevent a second Great Depression. And your own CBO numbers confirm that the Recovery Act was a key ingredient in stopping the free fall and was responsible, by your numbers, of creating or saving between 1.3 and 3.4 million jobs. I think we all recognize that despite the fact that the economy has stabilized somewhat, the fact that millions of Americans remain out of work is absolutely unacceptable. And what this report makes clear is that we do have to work together on a bipartisan basis to put our country on a fiscally sustainable path. I believe that the President's bipartisan commission that the chairman and others served on provided a lot of ideas that we should discuss and debate within this committee. They deserve a full vetting. And I would point out that the commission recognized the balance between acting now on a long-term plan and the dangers and risks of taking immediate deep cuts and the impact that could have on the economy. And in fact, they said, and I quote, "In order to avoid shocking the fragile economy, the Commission recommends waiting until 2012 to begin acting programmatic and spending cuts." We're going to have that debate, and I think we should also recognize, and we do, that focusing on just one sliver of the budget, domestic discretionary cuts, will not get us out of this hole. That is very clear from your report, and we're going to have to look at all the components of this problem, and I hope that we will all come to the table with a sense of seriousness that that we do need to look at the full picture going forward. Let me just end with this, because it has been much discussed in the news lately. We're coming up upon some key decision points. We have to extend the CR, and then, of course, there's the debt ceiling limit. I think it was very clear from the testimony of Dr. Bernanke yesterday that we should not be playing political games with the full faith and credit of the United States, that we should not be, as in his words, using that as a, quote, bargaining chip, that would risk putting the economy in a total tailspin and putting even more Americans out of work. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Dr. Elmendorf, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and Congressman Van Hollen, I want to start by saying I am honored and delighted to have the opportunity to stay at CBO for 4 more years, and I appreciate both of your support in that. And on behalf of myself and all of my colleagues, I want to say to you and all the members of the committee that we look forward to working with you, providing the information and analysis on the country's economic and budgetary challenges that would help you in wrestling with those challenges. Indeed, the United States faces daunting economic and budgetary challenges. The economy, as you know, has struggled to recover from the recent recession. The pace of growth and output has been anemic compared with that during most other recoveries. The unemployment rate has remained quite high. Federal budget deficits and debt have surged in the past 2 years, owing to a combination of the severe drop in economic activity, the policies enacted in response to the financial crisis and recession, and an imbalance between spending and revenues that predates the recession. Unfortunately, it is likely that a return to normal economic conditions will take years. And even after the economy is fully recovered, a return to sustainable budget conditions will require significant changes in tax and spending policies. Let me discuss the economic outlook first and then turn to the budget outlook. CBO expects that production and employment will expand in the coming years, but at only a moderate pace, leaving the economy well below its potential for some time. We project that real GDP will increase about 3% this year and again next year, reflecting continued strong growth in business investment, improvements in both residential investment and net exports, and modest increases in consumer spending. But we have a long way to go on the employment front. Go to the first slide. Payroll employment, which declined by nearly 9 million between the end of 2007 and early 2010, has recovered by just a shade over 1 million since then. The recovery in employment has been slowed not only by the slow growth in output, but also by structural changes in the labor market, such as a mismatch between the requirements of available jobs and the skills of job seekers. We estimate that the economy will add roughly 2.5 million jobs per year over the 2011-2016 period, similar to the average pace during the late 1990s. Even so, we expect that the unemployment rate, shown in the next slide, will be just above 9% in the fourth quarter of this year, and still above 8% at the end of 2012. Only by 2016 in our forecast does the unemployment rate reach 5.25%, close to our estimate of the natural rate. CBO projects that inflation will remain very low in 2011 and 2012, reflecting the large amount of unused resources in the economy, and will average no more than 2% a year between 2013 and 2016. Economic developments and the government's responses to them have, of course, had a big impact on the budget. The next slide shows we estimate that if current laws remain unchanged, the budget deficit this year, the third column of that table, will be close to $1.5 trillion, or 9.8% of GDP. That will follow deficits of 10% and 8.9% of GDP in the past 2 years, representing the three largest deficits since 1945. As a result, debt held by the public will probably jump from 40% of GDP at the end of fiscal year 2008 to nearly 70% at the end of this fiscal year in September. If current laws remain unchanged, as we assume for CBO's baseline projections, budget deficits would drop markedly over the next few years as a share of output. The next slide shows the deficits would average 3.6% of GDP between 2012 and 2021, that's the solid line, totaling nearly $7 trillion over the coming decade. As a result, the debt held by the public would keep rising, reaching 77% of GDP in 2021. However, that projection is based on the assumption that spending and tax policies unfold as specified in current law. Consequently, and as the chairman noted, it understates the budget deficits that would occur if many policies currently in place were continued rather than allowed to expire as scheduled in current law. For example, suppose instead that three major aspects of current policy were continued during the coming decade. First, that the higher 2011 exemption amount for the alternative minimum tax is extended, and along with the AMT tax brackets is indexed for inflation. Second, that the other major provisions in the recently enacted tax legislation that affected individual income taxes and gift taxes and state taxes were extended, rather than allowed to expire in January 2013. And third, that Medicare's payment rates for physician services were held constant, rather than dropping sharply as scheduled at the end of the year under current law. All of those policies have recently been extended for 1 or 2 years. If they were extended permanently, deficits from 2012 through 2021 would average about 6% of GDP, the dashed line, rather than 3.5% under current law. And cumulative deficits over the decade would total nearly $12 trillion. The next slide shows the debt held by the public in 2021 would, under that alternative, rise to almost 100% of GDP, the highest level since 1946. Beyond the 10-year projection period, further increases in federal debt relative to the nation's output almost certainly lie ahead if current policies remain in place. Spending on Social Security and the government's major mandatory health care programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and insurance subsidies to be provided through exchanges, will increase from roughly 10% of GDP to about 16% over the next 25 years. To prevent debt from becoming unsupportable, the Congress will have to substantially restrain the growth of spending, raise revenues significantly above their historical share of GDP, or pursue some combination of those two approaches. The longer the necessary adjustments are delayed, the greater will be the negative consequences of the mounting debt, the more uncertain individuals and businesses will be about future government policies, and the more drastic the ultimate policy changes will need to be. However, changes of the magnitude that will ultimately be required could be disruptive. Therefore, Congress may wish to implement them gradually so as to avoid a sudden negative impact on the economy, particularly as it recovers from the severe recession, and so as to give families, businesses, and state and local governments time to plan and adjust. Allowing for such gradual implementation would mean, however, that remedying the nation's fiscal imbalance would take longer, and therefore that major policy changes would need to be enacted sooner to limit the further increase in federal debt. Thank you. Happy to take your questions.
I thought you were going to go through the whole PowerPoint.
No.
Talk about 40
No,
pages here.
So all of the figures from the Outlook are in the collection of slides, and they're there. In case you want
Is
to
your whole PowerPoint that you handed us up? Jose, can you bring up page 16 on his PowerPoint, figure 223? You have, I'm very interested in your comparisons, recovery in real gross domestic product and employment, the current cycle and the average cycle since 1948, where you look at months before the trough, months after the trough. Thank you. Give me an explanation as to why you think this is occurring. What this is showing us is our economy is not growing nearly as fast as it typically does coming out of a deep recession, and jobs are not being created anywhere close to what they're typically created coming out of a recession. And if you take a look at past recessions post-World War II, typically, and correct me if I'm wrong, the deeper the recession, the bigger the bounce coming out of it. What's different this time? Why is this happening? What's your take on that?
So first, a quick factual point, which is that there were revisions to employment data recently released since we completed the Outlook that actually make the latest cycle look a little worse still on the employment front. We have not yet regained all the jobs that were lost by the time of
But
the
this
recession.
methodology is what we've always been using in the past, correct?
Oh, it's the same. Yes, the same methodology. It's just they've updated the data just a bit. We think the principal reason why the employment recovery has been so weak is that the output recovery has been so weak. Output grew much more rapidly following the very severe recession in the early 1980s, for example, than it has following this recession. This pattern, although unusual for U.S. post-war history, is unfortunately not unusual by the standards of other countries that have experienced recessions following financial crises. Those crises tend to come from an overbuilding of some aspect of the economy, in our case, particularly from housing, and have come when there have been excesses in the financial system that have then broken down in a way that takes time to rebuild. So we're watching our banks try to rebuild their capital. We're watching households and businesses try to rebuild their own balance sheets. Those kinds of recoveries tend to be slow. And we think that's the principal reason why this recovery is slow, is the severity but also the nature of the recession.
Okay, so you're basically saying it's the kind of recession we had, a financial crisis-driven recession, is why we have such lackluster recovery.
I think that's the principle.
Okay,
Yeah.
and let me ask you this then. Do you agree with the general conclusions of the Reinhardt-Rogoff study, which more or less says financial crashes, recessions result in big debt increases and deficit increases, which gets us in a vicious cycle, which once our debt starts hitting these trouble levels, we really start tapering off our economy. Would you generally agree with that, the takings of that?
Yes, I would. Carmen Reinhardt is one of the members of our panel of economic advisors. Of course, we've read their work, and I think the point they've highlighted about how these crises lead to rapid buildups of debt is exactly what we're seeing right now in the United States.
So their rule of thumb, 90% of GDP debt. Do you agree with that general rule of thumb? Was once you start hitting 90% of GDP, that's when your economy really starts slowing down. Would you more or less agree with that?
I want to be careful not to suggest that we.
I know there's not a magic hinge point, but
there is a tipping
Right.
point. Their study looked first, as you know, at gross debt. For the United States, a larger number than debt held by the public.
and we're already up at that number then if we're looking.
I think that's correct. We think for a variety of reasons that debt held by the public is a better measure of the government's current fiscal position. Also, they just divided countries into buckets, as you will. They picked a point of 90%. But we don't, in any sense, doubt the conclusion that higher levels of debt lead to worse economic performance over the medium and long run.
What is the debt held by the GDP at the end of the 10-year window in the alternative fiscal scenario?
So that particular label we applied to the long-run scenario that we did. But if you take the thing we've done in this outlook, where we've extended this particular set of policies that I mentioned, debt is pushing 100% of GDP by the end of the 10-year window.
And gross debt, I guess, gross debt would be
Significantly larger.
Significantly larger.
I don't know the number. This is unfamiliar territory for the United States, and also for other developed countries. If one looks at the set of countries in the OECD, the set of developed countries, one does not find a lot of countries that have debt at or above 100% of GDP for any length of time. So we are definitely, especially with those policies are continued, moving into territory where we don't know what will happen exactly.
I want to be judicious with my time. I think that there's a good argument to be made that interest rates are not going to be low for a long time. I think there's it's worth our while to make different interest rate simulations. You've done this for us in the past, and we've asked for this from you this currently. What we've asked is give us the blue chip average, the average of the 90s, the average of the 80s. If there are other worthwhile simulations to run that we're not thinking of, let us know. But also, can you carry this out in your long-run model for us as well? You can give us the 10-year numbers, I know, and I know how difficult this gets, and you do your long report in the summer, but I think it would be extremely helpful to know different simulations and how it really carries out beyond the 10-year window. The other question is, so that's just a request. Healthcare take-up rates in the exchanges. How many people do you project will be in the healthcare exchange within the 10-year window?
That's a good question. You might think I would remember the answer to that. I don't offhand.
I think 19 million is what I have off the top of my head. I'm not sure about that.
There are some people who are in the exchanges because their employers choose to get insurance coverage for them through the exchanges. So there are some different numbers depending on exactly what concept one has in mind. But I think you are in the right ballpark.
So other actuaries, private sector actuaries, have made much different projections about the amount of which employers will drop health insurance for their employees and dump them into the exchange. I think it would be worth our while to run some simulations on those projections as well. So how about if we shoot you projections from other actuaries who believe, I'll give you one example. I've met with an employer in my district who nationwide employs 7,000 people. It's a privately held company who has a very low margin business, who has two publicly held traded competitors. Their competitors have basically said, we're putting our people in the exchange as soon as we can. $2,000 indexed at inflation per employee, and they can go get health care there subsidized by the government versus $17,000 rising at health care costs. We're dumping them. And I know you have a firewall assumption that leads to low take-up rates, but from my experience, from talking to employers, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that firewall is going to hold. and I think tens of millions of people. This is my personal opinion, but it's informed by anecdotal conversations with employers all over the state of Wisconsin and outside expert actuarial witnesses that think we're going to have, tens and tens of millions of people dumped in these exchanges. So I think it's worth our effort to run simulations to see what kind of fiscal hit we would get under this law with that. The last question is this, and that's not a question, that's a request. The last question is, it's been argued, and it was argued here yesterday with the chairman, that the new health care law will create jobs and increase labor force participation. But if I recall from your analysis, it was quite the opposite. Is that not the case?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Again, I could go on and on, but I'll turn it over to Mr. Van Hollen and try to introduce.
Could I use just a minute to just quickly respond to a few aspects of that, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, sure.
So one thing to say is that we do show in the back of our outlook the effects of alternative economic assumptions on budget outcomes. One of the alternatives that we show is the effect of interest rates being 1 percentage point higher for the entire next decade. Under that alternative, extra interest costs for the federal government would be about $1.25 trillion. And if interest rates were lower by a percentage point, then there would be $1.25 trillion less interest payments. We can certainly look at alternative.
Yeah, your average is like less than 4% for the decade, correct? Or what is it? It's around between 4 and 5, or?
I don't remember the average, but it's worth noting that our interest rate projection is above the financial markets reading on interest rates. Our own model actually has somewhat higher, would predict somewhat higher interest rates.
And you've just recently revised that upward,
We have moved between, I don't remember the revision exactly, but we put our forecast somewhere between our own modeling and what financial market participants are saying. But we can look at other scenarios, of course.
I just think the recent movements of the yield curve and some other procyclical indicators warrant us looking at different simulations and seeing what the fiscal effects of that would be.
Enrollment in insurance exchanges, we project that to be 24 million by 2019, which was the last year of our original cost estimate. And we project that only 3 million fewer people would have employer-sponsored insurance coverage. I understand that you don't think that is right. There are many longer explanations I could give. Let me just say quickly that I know 4 other groups that have built sophisticated models of the health insurance system, somewhat analogous to ours. Those at the Office of the Actuary at CMS, those at RAND, at the Urban Institute, and at Lewin Associates. All 4 of those groups show the same or less employer dropping of health insurance coverage as a result of that legislation than we show. Now, we and they are all operating off of a very limited set of evidence, off of the effects of much smaller changes in policies than has now been enacted. And so I don't take huge comfort in their having similar answers. I think the range of true uncertainty is larger than the range of differences in our estimates. But our estimate is quite consistent.
Sure, I
with
understand.
the bulk of the professional analysis of this question.
And it bases, I could go on. Labor market participation, tightness and looseness of the labor market factors into all of this stuff, competing for labor based on benefits.
Yes,
You
exactly.
can go on and on and on, Mr. Van.
Would the chairman yield for a minute for a point of clarification?
Sure.
Of the term that you used, Mr. Chairman, dumping their employees into the exchange.
Yes.
Is the definition of exchange a group of insurance companies operating there, or is it just one entity?
It's employers no longer offering health insurance to their employees and sending them into the
definition of
exchange.
exchange. The definition of exchange is
To an employee, they have one exchange. If I'm in Wisconsin, I'm going in the Wisconsin exchange.
right, but the exchange has many insurance companies operating within it.
Yeah,
or-
you have gold, silver, and bronze.
Okay, so it's not that they're dumping into something that may be less than. It could be that they give more choices.
Sure, but the
that's
taxpayer's on the hook for it now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for your testimony. Let me just start out where I know we agree, which is the levels of debt that are projected in the CBO report in the out years are unacceptable and unsustainable. Whether you're drawing the line at 80%, 90%, or 100% or above, I mean, the fact remains that we cannot afford as a country to get into that kind of territory. There is, however, I think, a very important debate, as you indicate in your testimony, about how you get there. And I couldn't agree more with your statement that the sooner we make a decision to put in place a plan to deal with the debt in the out years, the less painful it would be. and that if you do too much in the very short term, it could be disruptive to the economy. And again, as I indicated in my opening statement, the bipartisan commission that was tasked with the job of identifying ways to reduce the deficit and the debt warned that you don't want to have a negative impact on the economy and growth in the short term, because we all would agree, would we not, that to the extent the economy were to slow down, that would obviously contribute in a negative way to our debt, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Now, it is true, isn't it, that if you were to make immediate deep cuts, that would be a drag, at least in some measure, on the economy and the jobs in the short term. Is that right?
Yes, Congressman. A year or so ago, we analyzed a set of policies being considered as ways to boost output and employment, and we looked at a variety of reductions in taxes, including the payroll tax that was enacted. We looked at some increases in government spending. Our analysis then was that under the current economic circumstances and the current posture of monetary policy, that increases in government spending would, in the short run, increase output and employment. And the logic works in reverse, that decreases in spending would decrease output and employment in the short run. Of course, as you understand, over the medium run and long run, the extra debt that is accumulated worsens the economic situation. But there is some trade-off there for you and your colleagues in deciding what pace to move in putting fiscal policy on a sustainable path.
Right, and the President indicated in the State of the Union address that he will impose in his budget that will arrive Monday a 5-year freeze on non-security domestic discretionary spending, which by his account comes to about $400 billion in savings over a period of time. I would just, Mr. Chairman, like to enter into the record an example of the impact of just one of the cuts that was identified by the Appropriations Committee yesterday. That's the cut to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund of about a cut of $1.15 billion. That's a matching fund, so states and localities have to match it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very respected consulting firm, RTI International, out of North Carolina, has done an analysis of the impact of that cut on the economy. I mean, this is one of those kind of investments we've talked about. This is a public investment, transportation, water infrastructure. And by their account, that cut will result in between 36,800 and 50,600 fewer engineering and construction jobs. So these decisions to withdraw investments in public infrastructure have an immediate impact on jobs in the economy. Let me just ask you, turn quickly to the question of the different components of the challenge as we approach deficit reduction. Because one of the first actions that was taken in this House was to eliminate the pay-go rule and replace it with a rule that was more one-sided. In other words, the rule said, well, yes, we have to take into account and pay for cuts, but not with respect to certain revenues, spending cuts. Isn't it the case that if you reduce revenues, you increase the deficit?
Yes, Congressman, that's correct.
Well, no, but the math, I will tell you, I thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, and I'm not referring to the chairman here, but there have been a lot of people making statements around here suggesting that there's not a correlation there. So as we approach this issue, it seems to me we should have rules that recognize that the deficit is increased not just by actions on one side of the equation. Let me turn last to the health care question. And I want to ask you about the deficit impact, but before I do that, as I recall, one of the reasons you argued that you said with respect to the labor market would have maybe some small impacts, but one of the impacts you said was that there will be some individuals who, because they can get their health care through the exchange and no longer have to get health care through their employer, would now have the freedom to choose to not get a job simply because they needed the health care. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
But I do need to say, on balance, as you mentioned, we think that the enactment of the legislation reduced by a small amount, roughly 0.5%, the amount of labor that workers would supply and would be demanded would be used in the economy by the end of the decade when the law was fully phased in.
And finally, Dr. Elmendorf, with respect to the CBO projections on the impact on the deficit going forward, as you know, one of the first actions taken by the new Congress was to repeal the health care reform law. You wrote to the Speaker of the House on January 6th of this year indicating that your assessment would be that that would add $230 billion to the deficit over the next 10 years and approximately 1.4 trillion over 20 based on your projections of GDP growth. Is that correct?
So the former number is correct, and we noted carefully in the estimate that this was pending our complete evaluation using our new economic and technical assumptions. We also emphasized that that number assumed that the law would otherwise have unfolded as enacted without changes, and as we've said for a number of years now, and as you've seen yourself, important changes in policy are often followed by further changes in policy. It's not clear that everything will unfold as enacted, but that is our job, is to square legislation as it is written. The second number you did for the 20 years we did not use. We have carefully referred to longer-term budgetary effects as shares of GDP. It's not just a semantic issue. We think it appropriately signals the greater uncertainty that tends to those longer-term estimates, and also appropriately adjusts for the fact that the economy is growing, there will be some inflation, that pure dollar numbers from 2025 don't mean very much to most people. But we did estimate originally, and then repeated in this letter to which you refer, that, again, if the law had otherwise unfolded as enacted, that repealing it would increase deficits in the second 10 years as well as in the first decade.
If I could just one follow-up, thank you, Mr. Chairman. But just to be clear on the second decade, as you indicated, you expressed your estimate in terms of GDP, and you did say that you believed that repealing the health care reform law would increase federal deficits in the decade after 2019 by an amount that is in a broad range around 0.5% of GDP, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And CBO has done estimates of what it projects GDP to be during that period, right?
Yes.
And so that's how we got the figure 1.4, was we took CBO's estimates of what GDP would be during that year and applied the percent savings you indicated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Something tells me this conversation is going to continue. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Elmendorf, and we'll continue this conversation right now. First on healthcare, before I get to broader issues. You just mentioned that you believe, or that in your estimates, that the healthcare law would reduce the labor used in the economy by about 0.5%. Given that I believe you say there's 160 million full-time people working in 2021, that means that in your estimation, the healthcare law would reduce employment by 800,000 in 2021. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the way I would put it is that we do estimate, as you said, that the household employment will be about 160 million by the end of the decade. 0.5% of that is 800,000. That means that if the reduction in the labor used was workers working the average number of hours in the economy and earning the average wage, that it would be a reduction of 800,000 workers. In fact, as we mentioned in our analysis last summer, the legislation also creates some incentives that might affect the number of hours people worked, and might affect the propensity to work of lower and higher income people. We haven't tried to quantify those things, but the impact is that the 800,000 might not be exactly the number.
Oh, sure.
But it's the equivalent of withdrawing 800,000.
Sure, but that's your best estimate at this point. You just pointed out that the healthcare law also beyond 10 years increases the deficit. And prior to 10 years, there's this whole issue about the cuts in payment rates to providers of services for Medicare programs. Can the same dollar of Medicare savings both improve the long-term solvency of the Medicare program and fund a new entitlement? Can the same dollar be used for both those functions?
So as you know, as you understand, Congressman, the way the budget works is that if a dollar less is spent out of the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, Part A of Medicare, that is a dollar less of overall government outlays. It improves the deficit by a dollar. It also means that the Medicare Part A Trust Fund, the HI Trust Fund, ends up with an extra dollar's worth of government securities that it holds. And as we've written before, those bonds in the trust fund for Medicare and for Social Security have important legal meaning. They are real government debt backed by the full faith and credit of the government, but they don't have much economic meaning because, as you are suggesting, if one saves a dollar by not spending it in some place and one then spends the dollar in some other place, one has not improved the ability of the government to ultimately meet future Medicare or Social Security obligations. And thus the total increment to the HI Trust Fund from the health legislation enacted last year was much larger than the increment that we estimate to government saving. And that excess is real bonds for the trust fund, but does not reflect an improvement in the government's ability to meet those later Medicare obligations.
And if you don't double count this, it does change the numbers or the computations for the first 10 years, does it not?
Well, I want to be careful. We do not double count. We kept track of every piece of the legislation and its effect on the budget once and only once. But our estimates refer, as all of our estimates do, to the effects on the overall government budget. So there is no double counting that we have done. I think the issue you're raising is how many benefits of the legislation one can claim credit for at the same time.
Okay.
But that's not my end of the business.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I now have just slightly over a minute to get to what I wanted to get to, but other than this, but suffice to say on the health care plan, you think it's going to reduce employment over 10 years. It certainly increases the deficit after 10 years, and there clearly is a debate about what it does within 10 years. So how that is good for what we're talking about here in the Budget Committee, I don't know. But in my remaining minute, I just wanted to mention real quick, first of all, I share the chairman's accolades as far as CBO and yourself and what you all do. And that you have a very difficult job. You have to predict not only the vicissitudes of interest rates and the marketplace and GDP, but the vicissitudes of Congress as well, and what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. And when I look at the baseline projection versus your alternative, and when the baseline includes tax increases, which nobody currently is advocating, including the president, including Democrats in Congress, including Republicans in Congress, when it includes cuts to Medicare or to the so-called doc-fix providers that none of us have yet been willing to do and so forth. I look at the alternative scenario as a much more likely scenario based on what's going on. And I can go through other things. I mean, your interest rate projections, even though you've moved them up, still you have the 10-year Treasury bond below anything it was at during all the 80s and the 90s. And through much of the 70s, I believe, if I have your figure 2.7 right. So anyway, now my time is up. But whole point is that this 100% of GDP debt in 2021 is a realistic possibility and not some pie-in-the-sky number.
So, Congressman, we are not trying to predict what you and your colleagues will do. We are trying to illustrate the effects of alternative policy paths. It's up to you all to judge what you think is likely. But we do say in the report that with more and more large pieces of policy being set on a explicitly temporary basis, with many members talking about their interest in extending those, we think that the current law baseline has become less useful in showing the thrust of current policies, and that's why we're trying to illustrate some alternatives for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Schwartz.
Thanks. Ms. Schwartz, it's hard to say. I recognize that. Anyway, I will not ask you to repeat it because you've been absolutely very clear in the answers to the previous questioners that the health law that is law of the land now reduces deficits over 10 years and over 20 years, and you have not double counted anything.
That's correct, Congressman.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll be saying that over and over again, but you keep saying it, everybody else says it, and we keep hearing that it's not understood by the other side. What I want to do is to try and just focus on a couple of statements you've made, but I wanted to just reiterate some of them and be clear about where we are on the budget deficit and where we're going. We all agree that the deficit is a problem and the national debt is a problem, and that we want to reduce the deficit. Lots of ideas out there about how to do it. But in the short term, the Republican majority has made, I'll try to ask the questions in a short way and ask you to answer them in a short way. They've changed the rules of the way we count spending and what adds to the deficit in this new Congress. We went from pay-go rules to cut-go.
They've changed the House. The House rules
House
have
rules.
changed.
Yes.
We count the deficit the same way.
Well,
we add up all the.
That's what I want to make sure about. Is that that's what I wanted you to answer about. The new rules actually say that they have to find a way to, if they're going to do spending cuts, that's going to they have to offset any spending changes, but they don't have to offset or really count. In their rules, you will have to do it differently, count any changes in tax policy, tax cuts in particular. So just to relate to a family budget, it's like saying, all right, if things are tight, we're going to cut back on going out to dinner or going to the movies or, entertainment for our kids. We just can't afford to do it. But in fact, if you get laid off from work and you have no more salary, we're not counting that. And maybe our checking account won't notice. Isn't that kind of what they're doing? You can't do it, but that's what they're saying they're going to do. We're not going to notice that there's less money coming in.
Well, so
or account for it.
Congressman, we keep track of all the changes in spending and revenues, and reductions in revenues increase the deficit, just as increases in spending increase the deficit.
So you will help us keep on track. We can go to CBO. You'll actually be able to tell us that this could and will add to the deficit if, in fact, there are tax cuts, for example, that they don't want to pay for.
The structure of our cost estimates is not altered by this change in the House.
We're going to look towards you to actually help us with that and help the public understand that that is adding to the deficit, not helping us fix the deficit. Second, they also are looking at the budget as only cutting. They only want to cut spending in one piece of the budget. They're only looking at cutting proposals for spending in non-defense discretionary. Now, the average American, what does that mean? So I'm going to ask you, what percentage of the budget is that? They're looking for all of the spending cuts, particularly the early ones, to come out of one part of the budget. Is that the biggest part of the budget? What part of the budget is it?
No, it's not. So as you know, the government spends much more on the mandatory programs, entitlement programs, than it does in discretionary spending.
And defense? What about defense?
So I have at hand in front of me the numbers for 2021, if one looks at the end of the decade, at which Social Security would be 21% of government spending. The major health programs would be 27%. Defense would be 15%. Net interest payments, 17%. And all other spending, 20%,
20%.
one-fifth. That's under the assumption that these certain policies are extended.
So can we get to deficit reduction if the only, at least for the short term, the only issue on the table is 18 to 20% of our budget, and they're going to take all of these cuts, pretty dramatic ones in some cases, from one part of that budget? Most economists, most advisors have said you've got to look at everything. Everything's got to be on the table, both tax revenue, tax policy, spending in all categories, in order to actually get to serious deficit reduction. So that between the rules of the way they're going to do, any of the work they're going to do going forward, ignores a big piece, that is tax cuts, and they're also now looking for all the spending cuts to come out of really just one piece of the pie, under 20%.
So, Congresswoman, the policy choices are yours and your colleagues. It's certainly true that the piece of the pie represented by non-defense discretionary spending is not a very large piece of the government's total spending. One can reduce the deficit with any given piece, but if one wants to achieve a goal of stabilizing the debt-to-GDP ratio or a more ambitious goal of balancing the budget, then just as a matter of arithmetic, that is very hard to do, focusing on just one-fifth of the budget.
Thank you. I would just simply say we are here in a CR because the majority last year didn't pass a budget at all. Nothing. Pass a CR that goes till March 4. So here's where we are. Discretionary spending is what is on the table right now because the last majority didn't pass a budget. I just want to ask you one quick question. Can you count Class Act revenues? Can you count Class Act revenues both to go to the Class Act and to pay for a new entitlement?
The revenues, if revenues are collected
No,
for
can
class,
you use Class Act revenues to go to Class Act and a new entitlement? Can you use Social Security revenues to go to Social Security and a new entitlement? Can you use Medicare cuts to go to Medicare solvency and pay for a new entitlement? Can you use both those dollars for both purposes?
one can't use a single dollar to pay a dollar benefits here and a dollar benefits some other place.
All right,
No.
thank you.
Chairman, if I just briefly
Okay. No, I indulged, so I'll let you indulge.
Let me just say with respect to the point on the budget resolution. Number one, we did pass the budget enforcement resolution, which applied for 1 year. 1 year. This current fiscal year, 2011. I would point out that that budget enforcement resolution was less than the budget numbers submitted by the president. We then enacted a continuing resolution.
To March 4.
To March 4th.
Till March 4.
To March 4th. Which of course was even below the Budget Resolution Act that we had, and now we're talking about reducing that further. So the reality is that we did have a 1-year budget resolution for this fiscal year in
Well,
effect.
we can go back and forth, but I'm trying to challenge the presumption that we're suggesting we can balance the entire budget on this narrow slice of the budget. No, we're not making that presumption.
Right.
We're in discretionary because a CR is expiring March 4. With that, I'm going to go to Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, in your testimony, you say to prevent the debt from becoming unsupportable, policymakers must cut spending, raise taxes, or adopt some combination of these. But your own report states that raising taxes have consequences as well. In part, on page 25, it states that if growing interest costs were financed by raising taxes, quote, those rates could discourage work and savings and further reduce output. Could you describe further how raising taxes negatively affect work and saving?
So the reward that people get from working and saving is the amount that they take home from their job or the amount that they can take out of their bank account for investments later. And that depends both on what the employer is paying or the investment is yielding and also on the tax payments they need to make on that to the government. Increases in marginal tax rates, which say the rates that you pay on an additional dollar of income, will tend to discourage work and saving.
Sounds like the old Laffer curve.
Well, the Laffer curve is a particular extreme version of that. So I was going to say there's a lot of debate, a lot of research, and a lot of debate among economists about how sensitive work and saving are to those tax rates. The Laffer curve, which as Professor Laffer noted this morning in an article in the newspaper, is a concept that predates him by probably centuries, says that there is a point at which making tax rates even higher tends to reduce revenue, that you lose more than you gain.
I think it would be an accurate statement. If you tax someone 100% of the revenue, there's no inducement to work.
That is right. For most, I think a very wide spectrum of economists think that most tax rates in the United States today are not at or beyond that peak of the Laffer curve. But as I said, there is disagreement about just where that peak is and how large the disincentive effects are.
As customary, your baseline revenue estimates are based on current law. As such, the figures for 2013 and beyond assume increases in marginal tax rates, expansion of alternative minimum tax, various other tax hikes are scheduled to occur under current law, as you know. Based on the table of selected policy alternatives, these scheduled tax law would amount to a total tax increases of about $3.8 trillion through 2021, and revenue would rise to about 20% of GDP. Even with that significant tax boost, in fact that was accurate, would revenues ever even come close to catching up with spending under the what's going on today?
Well, revenues get closer, but that is not sufficient. As you say, our baseline projections include the expiration of those provisions of tax law, and we show deficits continuing.
And even looking beyond the 10-year window, isn't it fair to say that spending under the current policy would continue to outpace revenue, even if the tax revenues were built into the baseline projection?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Doggins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to agree with the expression of concern that our Chairman Ryan has made concerning the growth of our debt, and as well to agree with the need for us to ferret out every inefficiency in spending we can find, and indeed to make some cuts in spending even of programs that are performing well because of the size of that debt. The concern that I have, and I'm not asking you to take sides with reference to that concern, is the overly narrow focus of the chairman's approach to our debt problem. And let me ask you if it is not true that unpaid for direct expenditures and unpaid for tax expenditures have the very same effect on the size of our national debt.
Certainly, Congressman, a dollar of extra spending and
A dollar of lost revenue,
just as a
same
dollar of
effect.
lost revenue widens deficit
And
by a
indeed,
dollar.
in terms of the size of what's been left off the table by the chairman, the size of total tax expenditures each year, most observers have estimated rival the total amount of direct discretionary expenditures. Isn't that correct?
I think that's right.
It's a
Estimating the
sizable
total
amount.
effect of tax expenditures is difficult because of interactions among them and other things.
Exactly. But
estimates
both
I've
are big.
I've seen suggest that that is a very large number.
And so really when we make decisions about how we're going to deal with this debt, one of the things we can do is to cut direct spending. We can say, you know, families are just going to have to fend for themselves. We're going to cut the budget of law enforcement with regard to the Wall Street banks, with regard to the Wall Street security companies, with regard to the health insurance monopolies. We'd like to do something about that a little bit, but we just can't afford to do it anymore. And we can't afford clean air and clean water. We don't want as much environmental law enforcement as we've had. Let's cut that by $4 billion a year. And that might be one way to address the deficit. But can't we achieve the very same thing if we conclude that a provision in our tax laws that allows Wall Street financial enterprises to enjoy preferential treatment on some of their financing operations abroad and takes $4 billion a year, by closing that tax loophole, wouldn't it have the same effect on the deficit?
Dollar for dollar.
Dollar for
Yes,
dollar.
Congressman.
And the same thing with reference to cancer research, with reference to scientific research that might spur additional job growth. If we cut that by $500 million a year, that will help us solve the deficit, but perhaps with some very negative effects. Or we could eliminate the $500 million a year in what's called the look-through rule that advantages some multinationals in their interest, rents, and royalties that they earn abroad, and it'll have the same effect on the deficit. It is a choice that we need to make. Would we rather continue to advantage these foreign operations, some of which may actually encourage the export of American jobs overseas, or do we think it's better to cut cancer research and cut scientific research? That's really the choice the committee has to make rather than you, right?
Yes, Congressman.
And that's the problem with the narrow focus that the chairman and the Republican majority have brought to this hearing today. They only want to look at half the problem. And I believe we need to look at all of the expenditures, and especially the many tax advantages, tax preferences, exemptions that powerful lobbyists with their string of limousines up here have been able to get into our tax code. And that's not being done by this hyper-narrow focus that the majority has in this budget process. Now let me ask you about another aspect, and that's your estimates on job creation. You analyzed last year what would be the most effective ways to encourage job growth in our policies. And isn't it correct that one of the least efficient ways to encourage job growth is to extend permanently the Bush-Cheney tax breaks for the wealthiest people in our society?
Congressman, we did estimate that extending the across-the-board extension of the 2001-2003 tax cuts would have a low bang for the buck.
Right.
Affecting the economy per
There's no
dollar
way
wider deficit.
your conclusions were the same as almost every expert who's ever come before this committee, Republican or Democrat, that those tax cuts won't pay for themselves, that they will add significantly to the deficit, that they are an inefficient way to create job growth. If the objective is to encourage more job growth than what you have predicted, extending the Bush tax cuts permanently for the wealthiest in our society is the wrong way to go. Thank you.
The chair recognizes me. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for coming. My first question is spending. Under George Bush, would you say that spending grew faster or slower than it did under Bill Clinton?
Total federal spending, I don't.
That's percentage of GDP.
So actually, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. So total federal outlays in fiscal year 2008 were about 2.5 percentage points of GDP above where they were in 2000. And in 2000, they were about 4 percentage points of GDP below where they were in 1992.
So spending grew much faster under George Bush than it did under Bill Clinton.
Relative to the growth of the economy, yes, Congressman.
How about deficits under George Bush? Would you say they were bigger or smaller than they were under Bill Clinton?
They were a good deal bigger, Congressman.
Tell us, didn't we have a big stimulus program in February of 2008 under George Bush where we all got $600 checks to stimulate the economy?
There was, yes, I don't remember the total size of that legislation, but yes, there was those checks were issued.
Well, if higher and higher spending, bigger and bigger deficits, and massive government stimulus spending was the route to prosperity, I would have thought the George Bush administration would have ended with a new golden era for the American economy. Wonder how that happened. I guess that's a rhetorical question. I'll move on. Mr. Van Hollen warned us earlier today that deep cuts would be a drag on the economy. I was wondering if you could tell us about the Great Depression of 1946.
Congressman, as you know, there was not a Great Depression of
There wasn't a Great Depression in 1946? Well, how could that possibly be? In 1945, Harry Truman abolished the excess profits tax. He slashed federal income tax rates. In 1946, Harry Truman cut federal spending from $85 billion down to $30 billion in a single year. He fired 10 million federal employees, called war demobilization. How would you characterize the post-war economy under Harry Truman?
The economy performed well in the wake of the Second World War. It actually was a surprise to macroeconomic forecasters at the time. It's an interesting episode in history of economic.
I remember the
economic
Keynesians at the time, as I recall, were predicting 25% unemployment rate, a second Great Depression, and instead we had the post-war economic boom. That's very interesting. Maybe we stumbled upon something here.
Well, in fact, economists changed their models ever since that point to reflect some of the things that they learned during that episode.
Apparently, they haven't changed those models enough in the current administration.
So
if I may move on.
I'm not sure what you're suggesting. I think that the models the CBO uses for this and other sorts of analysis are at the cutting edge of the models that economists in universities and the private sector use for the questions that we analyze.
Glad to hear that. Would you tell us of other periods? Are there any other periods in our nation's history when our debt to GDP was comparable to what it is now?
Well, so during World War II, as you know, the debt ran up to a point above 100% of GDP,
right, and
then fell from that point during the 50s, 60s, and 70s relative to GDP.
Right. And any other times?
I wrote a paper once, but I forget, Congressman, the nature of debt in the
Revolutionary War debt, I believe, got us to about that same height, as I recall. How were those debts discharged?
Well, so in the wake of the Second World War, what happened was that the government's budget ran small deficits mostly, but was close to being in balance, so that nominal amount of government debt didn't change very much, and the economy grew. So as a burden on the economy, debt fell relatively.
So Harry Truman slashed taxes, slashed spending, slashed federal employees, and the economy grew out of a debt comparable to the one we have now.
That's right, Congressman. As you understand, of course, the path of the budget and the debt depends not just on the policies that you and your colleagues enact, but also on the economic circumstances, and your policies have some effect on those, but also there are many other influences in economic circumstances. one of the things that we take
If-
seriously in our
if I
estimates.
could, my time's fleeting, so if I could move on to a final question here. Mr. Van Hollen earlier today said that we must not jeopardize the full faith and credit of the United States government, and we all agree with that. Tell me, would the full faith and credit of the United States government be strengthened by requiring first call on revenues to go for debt service, as most other states already require?
To be honest, Congressman, I think that's unclear. The government has a range of obligations. It might be the case that protecting certain obligations and not others would then strengthen confidence in the government's commitment to paying those obligations. On the other hand, it might be the case that the government not honoring all of its obligations would then cast doubt on its commitment to honoring any of those obligations. I think most analysts with whom I've talked, and I've talked with a fair number, think that were the government to default on any of its obligations, those to debt holders and also those to people with regular contracts with the government and so on, that would represent a rolling of the dice about the investors' perception of the safety of U.S. securities. And I don't know any analysts who think that the government should roll those dice and see what happens.
Funny, other states do it all the time. Ms. McCollum is next.
Other states pay higher interest rates than the U.S. Treasury does, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to start my comments today with a reflection on a misstatement made during the hearing yesterday. After I left yesterday's hearing, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Aiken, referenced my statement, twisted my words into something I neither said nor implied, and I'm sorry he's not here. He was here earlier. I hope the gentleman's misrepresentation of my comments does not reflect the manner in which this committee will conduct itself in the future. As Mr. Aiken is from the Show Me State, I brought the transcript of yesterday's hearing with me, and I'd like to enter that in the record, but right now I would like to read from the transcript. Mr. Aiken, the comment was made earlier, I thought, which was an amazing quotation from Ms. McCollum, that the budget deficit is not a spending problem. I found that amazing because it seems to me, I want to quote him accurately. I found that amazing because it seems to me that it sure is a big spending problem. So we must be on different planets, I suppose. Mr. Chairman, I don't know what planet Mr. Aiken lives on, but in the real world, I pride myself with conducting myself with respect and civility with my colleagues. For the record, I want to restate my comments from the hearing transcript. Ms. McCollum, quote, I'm going to paraphrase a popular Tea Party slogan that goes something like this, quote, the federal government doesn't have a revenue problem, it has a spending problem. I went on to say, Chairman Bernanke, it seems clear to me that the deficit is not just a spending problem, end of quote. Nowhere in my statement did I say the budget deficit is not a spending problem. For new Tea Party members here of the committee, this is a good moment for a little bit of history. Mr. Aiken and I both entered Congress in 2001. Mr. Elmendorf, am I incorrect remembering back in 2001 there was a projected 10-year budget surplus of $5.6 trillion?
It was a large positive number, Congressman. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact figure.
At the time, Mr. Atkins' party, the Republican Party, before the addition of the Tea Party, controlled the House here and the White House. The surplus that President Clinton left the American people quickly vanished after President Bush and Mr. Aiken entered Congress, as was pointed out by the gentleman in the chair right now. Mr. Elmendorf, am I correct, or correct me if I'm wrong, that in 2001 and 2003, the Bush tax cuts, which I voted against and Mr. Aiken voted for and favored, contributed to the growth of the deficit by trillions of dollars?
Yes, that's correct, Congresswoman.
Again, Mr. Elmendorf, correct me if I'm wrong, but the war in Iraq, which I opposed and Mr. Aiken voted in favor for, added to the federal deficit by nearly $1 trillion.
Yes, Congressman, maybe over $1 trillion. I'm not exactly sure. It's a big number, though, as well.
Mr. Elmendorf, I also believe it's correct to say that the December's vote to extend the Bush tax cuts added $858 billion to the federal budget deficit. Is that not correct?
Yes, that's right, Congresswoman.
I raise this because this is another example of where Mr. Aiken and I disagreed. He voted to add $858 billion to the deficit by voting for tax cuts. Included in that were NASCAR's racetrack owners, tax breaks for Caribbean rum manufacturers, along with extra tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires. And I voted against the deficit-busting bill. So Mr. Aiken is very concerned about spending. His record to me would indicate that he has voted to add trillions of dollars to the national debt. Now, Mr. Elmendorf, would it be, what would be the effect on future deficits if Congress were allowed to let the Bush tax cuts expire in 2012 and did not the economic growth we saw under President Clinton include a tough vote in which no Republican helped Democrats vote that included a tax increase?
So Congresswoman, as you know, our baseline projections, which follow current law, assume that the tax cuts now scheduled to expire. As we show one of the policy alternatives in the report, if you and your colleagues instead voted to extend those expiring tax provisions, that would add trillions of dollars to the deficit over the next decade and thus to the accumulated level of debt by the end of the decade. And you're also right, Congresswoman, of course, that in the 1990s, a number of votes were taken to change policies in ways that reduced the deficit. And those actions, together with the strong economy, led to budget surpluses at the end of the 1990s.
Mr. Stutzman.
And just to clarify,
sorry.
because the clarification was that tax cuts were part of that decision under the Clinton administration to remove the
Change in
deficit.
tax policy were part of what happened yesterday.
Mr. Stutzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Doctor, for being here today. I want to go back to what Mr. Culver was talking about a little bit earlier with the tax rates and where we're at with our current tax rates, and specifically the corporate tax rate. The President, in his State of the Union address, closing loopholes and lowering the corporate tax rate. My question is would you agree with that, and how might that be accomplished? We've seen that other countries around the world are starting to adjust. Is the corporate tax rate maybe over the crest of a good Laffer curve, and are we starting to see job loss because of higher taxes and obviously I would say also more regulation?
So we have not done analysis to identify the peak of the corporate tax Laffer curve, but I think there's widespread agreement among analysts that lower tax rates applied to broader bases are a much more efficient way to raise any given amount of revenue that the Congress wants to raise. And we have some work underway that we hope to release soon that looks at our treatment of international aspects of the corporate business and how that's taxed and compared with the way that other countries address those issues, and we hope that'll be helpful to you and your colleagues in thinking about this question.
So you'll be taking a look at other countries around the world that have adjusted their corporate tax rates, and
it's a comparison of how the study looks at how adopting different sorts of systems of the sorts that exist in some other countries might affect the incentives for U.S. companies to engage in various kinds of behavior.
Okay. What kind of, we all talk about simplicity and simplifying the tax. Would you agree that we have a very complex tax code and that it should be simplified?
Again, I think very widespread view that a simpler tax code would be more efficient in terms of people and companies spending less time filling out forms, and would also be perceived probably as being fairer than the complicated tax system that we have now.
Because, I think that, a lot of the American people obviously, want both sides to fix the problems in Washington. And, we can sit here and point fingers at each other all day long, but that's not going to fix the problems. And I think they want simplicity. I think they want fairness and equitable taxation. The proposal's been thrown out with the flat tax or the fair tax. Could you comment on one of those? Is that part of a solution?
So we haven't studied those proposals specifically. In order to reduce the deficit, one has to either spend less or raise more revenue. It's, again, I think a widespread view among analysts that if one wants to raise more revenue than some benchmark, that it's more efficient to do so if one has a better tax system in the sense of having a broader base and lower tax rates. The discouraging effect on work and saving that I discussed earlier with one of your colleagues come really from the level of tax rates. And one can, as we did as a country in 1986, restructure the tax system in a way that can bring down tax rates while broadening the base. But again, if one wants to reduce the deficit through this action, one has to ultimately raise more revenue than under some alternative.
But raising more revenue is obviously through growing the economy, not just raising taxes.
That's right, but I think as Chairman Bernanke said yesterday, and as many people have said, the size of the current imbalance between spending and revenues in the United States is not something that can be closed through any conceivable, feasible growth rate.
Do you have any idea how do we compare to some of as far as our regulatory measures in this country compared to around the world? We know some countries already adjusting corporate tax rates. Are they also adjusting and correcting their regulatory systems as well?
So there's certainly changes going on in lots of places, and in a lot of other developed countries. In Europe, where they are feeling fiscal stress, there are changes, important changes in policy. They're meant to help those economies grow faster, as you said, and to make other changes in the budget. One needs to remember, of course, that most other developed countries are starting from levels of revenue relative to GDP that are a good deal higher than the levels in the United States. So if they bring those down, they're bringing them toward us for the most part, not beyond where we are. And of course, a number of countries are raising tax rates. The government in Britain, for example, is raising taxes as well as cutting spending. They are working on both sides of the ledger in an effort to reduce very large budget deficits. So I think different countries are doing different things, hopefully appropriate response to their situations, but that's not always clear.
Thank you.
Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Dr. Elmendorf. We all agree that the trajectories of our national deficit and debt are unsustainable, and that they place our nation's future in grave peril, and that it is this committee's responsibility to make this right for the American people. And with relative to Afghanistan and other things, the only way we can make it right is if we are honest about what we have placed, what has placed us in this predicament. Republicans have placed the blame entirely on Social Security, Medicare, discretionary spending, which provide for our working families and their parents in their old age. They want us to ignore that two policy of the Republican Party, the Bush tax cuts and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, accounted for over $500 billion of the 2009 deficit, and including interest, will account for almost $7 trillion over the next decade. So my question to you is this. With the savings that resulted from ending combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and allowing the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy to expire, reduce projected deficits?
Yes, Congressman, relative to the alternatives, yes. But I want to emphasize that our baseline projections include the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. So the baseline projection of deficits of $7 trillion include that expiration. They do not include a more rapid drawdown of troops overseas. We offer an alternative in our outlook that picks a particular scenario in which that reduction would reduce deficits by an additional $1.25 trillion. Still leave deficits in excess of $5 trillion over the coming decade.
And the technique that we use with a war on terror or Afghanistan, Iraq, if you will, the supplement, is that something that's directly attributable to the deficits that we're experiencing and a growing national debt?
Well,
in the way it's being done now.
So any form of spending, additional spending or tax reduction will widen the deficit. And
so
whether you enact that spending through a regular appropriation or a supplemental appropriation.
Is that a yes to that question?
Well, I'm not sure I understand you. It doesn't matter for the ultimate effect on the deficit whether you enact something in a supplemental appropriation or a regular appropriation. It's just a matter of you're authorizing the government to spend money.
And obligate.
Yes.
And create a deficit that's not balancing the budget. that would be financed from somebody that would be added to our national debt.
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
Thank you. The other one is investing in education and infrastructure. In your testimony, you highlighted the jobs crisis that continues to confront working and middle-class families. You cited two culprits, the anemic growth rate and structural changes in the labor market. In regards to growth, past CBO reports have recommended investments in transportation and infrastructure, while your observations regarding the changing labor market and the need to equip our workforce with 21st century skills, and to this implies a need for investment in education. So can you explain to this committee how public investments in education, transportation, and infrastructure promote economic growth?
Yeah, so first let me just clarify. We have not recommended any policies. That's not in our charter.
No, I'm
We
not
have
asking you.
analyzed the effects of policies.
Right.
And we've said that, for example, we released a report at the end of last year about the transportation and water infrastructure of the United States. And we, in this case, cited analysis by other people, other organizations, that that additional highway spending, if used on the projects with the greatest economic return, would have economic return that exceeded their costs. That doesn't, and other sorts of investments like education can, again, if effective, can enhance future economic output. I think the key, and this is a big issue, as you know, in the infrastructure discussions, is how to direct the money to a place, to certain sorts of projects that have high returns.
One of the high returns is not only job creation, but public safety. And we can see what happened in Minnesota. We don't keep up with our obligations. So it appears to me that the return on our investment is high and would be positive to our economic growth. Thank you.
Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for joining us today. You have an unenviable task. You and your team have an unenviable task of taking the projected policy impact on human behavior and organizational behavior and trying to convert that to numbers. And so I appreciate your efforts to try to do that. But that said, I think we can all agree that it's somewhat, even though you do your best, it can be somewhat subjective. And with that, one of the things that I'm going to ask you to keep in mind as we go forward is that we are marching off into uncharted territory as a country with high debt levels. And so the old models may not apply as we go forward. So I'm sure that there will be times when we talk about that as we go forward. First question is, how much has the federal debt grown in the last 3 fiscal years? It's over $4 trillion, right?
Yes.
Okay. There's been some commentary during this hearing about the extolling the virtues of PAYGO. In my view, growing our debt by $4 trillion while PAYGO is in operation would indicate that PAYGO has been an abject failure. The next thing I want to talk about is you said earlier in your testimony, not only today but earlier, that you don't get a good bang for the buck in terms of reducing taxes on the economy. Where do you get the bang for the buck?
So I don't think that's a fair characterization of what we've said.
Oh, good. Maybe I heard it wrong. I just want to make sure I heard it correctly then.
No, so we've said that it depends the short-term stimulative effect on the economy in a weak economy like ours is today depends very importantly on the nature of a spending or tax change.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, in our analysis, the highest bang for the buck was increasing aid to the unemployed, but the next 3 options ranked on our list were different ways of reducing employers' payroll taxes. So the methodology that we use does not have an intrinsic tax versus spending hierarchy. It's the nature of the policy. The payroll tax we think would be more effective than an across-the-board tax cut, the sort I was asked about earlier, because more of the money is directed to people who have less savings and are likely to spend a larger share of the extra income they receive.
Okay, well, that's helpful because the way I'd heard it originally, it was in contravention with what Christina Romer, who is the former chair of the President's economic team, who said at one time that the best bang in terms of economic, or the best bang for the buck in terms of increased economic activity was due to reducing taxes. How many jobs did the CBO estimate were created in stimulus spending?
So we estimated, I have it here. So our latest estimate is that employment in 2010 was between 1.25 and 3.25 million higher than it would have been in the absence of that legislation.
Okay, so that would indicate that we spent, for every job created, if you assume we spent $800 billion, that it cost $6 billion a job? Is that correct?
No, because so the midpoint of this range I described was 2.25
Okay, so
million jobs.
So a little less than $4 million a job is what it cost. Did I do my math? $400,000 a job.
I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know that number.
Okay, well, we ought to calculate it because it doesn't. I think the bottom line is that the stimulus spending is not a very efficient way to create jobs. If we run the math out, whether it's 400,000 or 4 million, I may have my math wrong too, but that is a very inefficient way to create jobs. And I think that the economic models will show that changes in tax policy have a much bigger impact on economic growth than do changes in federal spending. Thank you.
Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Okay. Thank you so much. Mr. Elmendorf, I want to ask you some questions. It actually is a perfect counterpoint to Mr. Flores' comments because I think he's exactly wrong in terms of both his explanation related to the Recovery Act and its impact, as well as what are the policies that provide us with the biggest bang for our buck. Tax cuts certainly provide a certain bang for the buck, but can you, my understanding and just reading a lot about how to recover from the recession and the best economic policies is that among the biggest bang for our buck is not so much tax cuts, but providing additional funds directly into the hands of low-income households. Things like that, like unemployment compensation and other policies that put money directly into the hands of people who need to use that money and can't really afford to sit on it. Am I right?
So you're right, Congresswoman, that in terms of the short-term stimulative effect of a policy, what matters most is whether the money gets spent. And giving it to lower-income people tends to lead to a larger share of the money being spent. Whether that's done through on the spending side or the tax side is less important than who the money goes to.
So just by way of comparison, would you say that unemployment compensation, a payroll tax holiday, other kinds of policies that put money directly into the hands of lower income individuals would provide more bang for the buck to the economy than, let's say, tax cuts for the wealthiest individuals?
In terms of the short-run economic stimulus, yes, Congresswoman.
Thank you. And then just on the Recovery Act itself, according to CBO's models, my understanding is that the Recovery Act increased employment in 2010 by somewhere between, and I think this is CBO's estimates, 1.3 million and 3.3 million people. Is that right?
That's right.
Yesterday, Chairman Bernanke was here, and he testified on the state of the economy, and he has previously observed that with the remainder of the Recovery Act funds set to expire, or not expire, but to be spent this year and then no longer be available to states and local governments, that the expiration or the expiration, for lack of a better term, of these stimulus funds is obviously going to worsen the outlook. I mean, my state is facing a $3.6 billion deficit, no longer have the stimulus funds available after the end of this year, and that would present a headwind for the overall economy. So can you give us a sense of whether you agree with his assessment?
Yes, I think that's right, that the waning effects of that of the Recovery Act represent a drag on economic growth over the next year or so, too.
So that fact, coupled with draconian cuts proposed, for example, in Chairman Ryan's plan, which is like an anti-recovery act, would you give us a sense of whether you think large spending cuts like that right away would be an additional drain on economic growth, especially when compounded with the expiration of the Recovery Act funds?
So our analysis, yes, implies that cutbacks in government spending under current economic conditions tend to reduce output and employment in the short term. And the issue that you and your colleagues face is how to balance that against the other problems that arise from the burgeoning national debt.
So potentially, if we cut too much too quick, and we have the expiration of the Recovery Act funds, with the state and local governments facing significant deficits to start with, couldn't we endanger the recovery?
Well, it could slow the recovery. Endangering, I think, depends importantly on the overall scale of the activity.
Yeah. Couldn't we? Obviously, the recovery has not been as quick as we'd like. Isn't it likely that the combination of all of those things would result in the recovery slowing as opposed to quickening?
Yes. I mean, our forecast, of course, builds in the things that are in current law, and additional cuts in spending in the near term would, we think, have some dampening effect on output and employment, and the magnitude depends on the magnitude of the cuts.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, I apologize. I'm going to move very quickly because I've added an additional topic I want to talk to you about. If I could bring the first graph up, that would be fantastic. Quick question. Can you have a deficit without spending? You can't, can you?
No, Congressman, you can't.
Okay, all right. This is a graph of the historical revenues and spending levels as a percent of GDP going back to 1960. I've heard some discussion today to suggest that we don't have a spending problem, that we have a spending problem and a revenue problem. Looks like historical revenues have averaged about 18% of GDP over the course of the last 40 years, and the spending has been about 20. Take a look, Doctor, back in the 1960s. It looks like we were taking in about 18% in terms of revenues percent of GDP. Do you remember what the top marginal rate was back then?
It was quite high.
Yeah. So even then, I think it was above 90 at that point. Even then, we weren't able to squeeze more than 18% of GDP out in terms of revenue. So we were soaking it to the rich pretty good. We couldn't get much above 18. In fact, the only time we've gone above 20 was during the dot-com boom of the late 1990s, early 2000s. Now, it looks like, according to your projections, because these are your projections, we do get revenues back at historically high levels in the next 10 years, that we get revenues back to 20% of GDP, and we still have a dramatic deficit in those years, don't we, sir?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
And that's because our spending is way above our historical average of 20%, correct?
That's right, Congressman.
All right. If I can bring up the second graph, please. Thank you for that, Doctor. I asked my staff to come up with something that has been bugging me since I've been here. And this is my own personal idea of what a tipping point is. I asked them to graph the projections using your numbers of the total revenues that the government expects to take in versus the interest payment obligations. Now, the top graph is, I think, what you call your extended baseline, but the bottom one is the alternative fiscal that I think folks around here tell me is what we use traditionally. Do you see what I see, Doctor? Do you see that in approximately,
I'm not sure what you see, Congressman.
Yeah.
I
in 2055, more than 100% of the expected revenues, using CBO numbers, will go to only interest payments. Now, I tell you that we put this together using your staff, and I would ask you, to the extent that a freshman has the opportunity to ask you to do this kind of stuff, to make sure those numbers are right. We work very closely using your assumptions, and I'm confident that they are, but I would be curious if you folks would also take a look at them as well. This comes back to the original point that I made yesterday with Chairman Bernanke regarding your assumptions on interest rates. If you take a look at the baseline, y'all's assumptions for this year in the 10-year Treasury, for example, just so we get apples to apples, is 3.4%. Last week, it traded at 3.5. Yesterday, while Mr. Bernanke was testifying, it traded at 3.7. Do you think at what point, sir, would you think it's reasonable for you to go back in and readjust your numbers to take in some more real-world considerations on interest rates?
So we update our forecast several times a year, Congressman.
Okay.
I would emphasize the time that we set this path for interest rates, we set a path that was above the path
Right.
in financial markets. And we did that because our own modeling suggested that rates seemed to us that they should be higher. On the other hand, there are a lot of people betting very large sums of money on what's happening in financial markets, and we thought it was appropriate for us to give weight exactly to the real-world considerations that you are highlighting.
And I'm not saying you, clearly, I'm not suggesting that your methodology was wrong. I don't think anybody expected a 100 basis point rise in the 10-year Treasury since October, but it's certainly the real world. And I suggest to you, Doctor, am I wrong when I say that higher interest rates will move that red line in the bottom curve further to the left, bringing closer the date at which our debt obligations will exceed our revenues?
That's right, Congressman, and we do show in an appendix to the outlook the effect of alternative assumptions about interest rates as well as GDP growth and inflation and so on the federal budget.
And I appreciate that. It was one of the best pieces of the thing that I read, where you all actually went down section by section and said, look, here's our assumptions on GDP, here's our assumptions on interest rates. If they are off by 1% or 1/10%, here's the output. By the way, the result of, if we have an interest rate that is 1 percentage point higher than your assumptions, we're looking at additional $1.3 trillion in debt over the course of the next decade. I'm going to ask you to do one last thing. Do you have your report in front of you, sir?
Yes, I do.
Could you turn to page 118, please?
Okay.
I ask you to read the last sentence beginning in January above the title that begins higher inflation. So it's the last section of the previous section.
In January 2008, under the laws in effect at that time, CBO projected that debt held by the public would total about $5 trillion by the end of 2018. In CBO's current projections, debt held by the public is close to $16 trillion by the end of 2018 and exceeds $18 trillion by the end of 2021.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for providing your insight to the committee. I appreciate it. In January of 2010, did you write a letter to Chairman Ryan concerning the analysis of Chairman Ryan's roadmap?
Yes, we did, Congressman.
And was that letter a formal cost estimate?
No, it was not.
Now, with the Ryan roadmap, in addition to restructuring several spending programs, it also puts forward a plan to dramatically restructure our tax system. As I understand it, according to a widely cited analysis by the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, this plan would cut in half taxes on the richest 1% of Americans. We all know that tax cuts don't pay for themselves, so under this plan, the burden of that high-income tax cut is then shifted to low- and middle-income families. In fact, according to the Tax Policy Center's analysis, about 3/4 of Americans would see their taxes increase. I find that drastic middle-class tax hike would be insufficient to put the federal budget on a sustainable path in the next several decades, and in addition is accompanied by provisions that threaten the health care for seniors, the health care for our most vulnerable populations, and plans to gamble Social Security checks on a stock market that we know has not been a friend to retirement accounts in the last few years. So did your letter do a specific analysis of the tax provisions of this roadmap?
No, Congressman. Because the Joint Tax Committee staff does the estimates in the 10-year window for changes in the Internal Revenue Code, our longer-term modeling focuses on the spending side of the budget. We haven't built the tax side of the budget, so we were unable to analyze the tax provisions, which is why you don't find that in our letter.
Okay, so you did nothing on the tax provisions. So for the purposes of your analysis, you used an assumption that the overall level of revenues collected would remain the same as they are under current policies through 2030 and would equal some 19% of GDP in the later years. Who provided you with that assumption?
So we follow the specification from Chairman Ryan and his staff. And
So was it the Joint Committee on Taxation that provided that information?
no, they didn't do that
So
analysis.
all of that assumption and all
Will
of
the gentleman
those
yield?
guidelines were done by
Would
the
Mr.
chairman.
Tonko, I can answer your question if you'd like. I mean, you're asking the wrong guy.
Well, I think he just said that
So, Congressman, we didn't have the capacity to model that part of the roadmap. In order to take the parts that we could model on the spending side and show how the pieces fit together, we followed and were very explicit in the letter that we just followed the policy as it was described to us by the
Right.
chairman in his
So
statement.
where we got, just if the gentleman will yield, where we got our revenue estimates from were the Office of Tax Analysis at the Treasury Department. Joint tax could not give us estimates, so we went to the next best source using the same model that joint tax uses to try and hit our revenue targets, which were to get to historic revenue levels. So our tax reform levels were set at what joint tax, at what OTA told us would hit us at revenue target levels, and that's how that became about that level.
so, and it's why Dr. Elmendorf then said that it was you, Chairman, and your staff that provided that information.
Yes.
Now, the Tax Policy Center analysis, unsurprisingly, finds that with a radical restructuring of our tax system comes a radical change in the amount of revenues collected. And we've heard many claims that circulating this year that the bottom 50% of Americans don't pay their fair share of taxes under our current system. Well, as of 2007, the bottom 50% of households in America, I'm informed, hold just 2.5% of this nation's wealth. And according to the claims of my Republican colleagues, they pay 3% of the taxes. That sounds to me like they're paying more than their fair share, and I would like your response to that.
But I don't have wealth numbers at hand. We did a testimony before the Senate Finance Committee in December that presented information on the evolution of marginal tax rates over time, as was mentioned earlier, and on the distribution of the tax burden. The federal tax burden is higher as a share of income on higher income people. Thus, the after-tax distribution of income is slightly less unequal than the before-tax distribution of income, but is still, of
A
course,
burden.
quite unequal. And
Thank
Mr.
you.
Rebel, is the right burden is up to you and your colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for being here today. I've enjoyed listening to the conversation quite a bit, and I've especially enjoyed your testimony today.
Thank you.
I can tell you, I've only been here a little over a month, and I've heard quite a bit just this morning that the Democrats did this and the Republicans did that, and it's their fault, and it's our fault, it's everybody's fault, and I got to tell you something, my grandkids don't care much about that. They care about what their future looks like. Do you believe when my grandson hits 20 at 2021 that $18 trillion debt makes his future more bright or less bright than a debt that would be lower than that?
Makes his future less bright, Congressman.
Okay, that's what I thought. That's why I'm here. I've also heard a lot that our debt and our deficit and our spending is on an unsustainable trajectory. I've heard that probably 100 times since I've been here. You use the word unsupportable. What level of debt and deficit spending would you consider supportable?
Well, it's as we've said in this report and other places, we don't know if there is a tipping point, and we don't know where the tipping point might be. It depends not just on the level of outstanding debt, but also on people's perceptions of where the debt is headed, what current policies will lead to in the future, and on the willingness of you and your colleagues to make changes in policy. So I don't want to pick a particular number. One criterion, though, for sustainable policy is that debt cannot continue to increase relative to the size of the economy. So the upward trajectory that we show, especially under this continuation of current policies scenario, is not sustainable because debt cannot continue to rise indefinitely relative to GDP.
So your words, I think these were your words, or maybe I'm paraphrasing here, that delaying our efforts to fix this problem would be bad.
That delaying we don't make policy recommendations, Congressman. What we've said very clearly is that delay increases the costs of the burgeoning debt, and it increases the drain on the future incomes, like your grandchildren. It increases the ultimate spending cuts or tax increases that will be needed to put the budget on a sustainable path. It reduces the flexibility that you and your colleagues have in dealing with unexpected problems in this country or overseas. And it raises the risk of a fiscal crisis.
So the longer we wait, the more difficult the fix is going to become in terms of how harshly we must cut or draw back.
That's right, Congressman. We in fact have a study we released in the fall about the cost of waiting, the impact of delaying efforts to address the fiscal imbalance.
And then along with that, and I realize you don't make policy suggestions here, but I'm assuming that at some point here, this Congress, I would hope it'd be this Congress or some very soon future Congress, is going to have to address the issue of entitlement spending, aren't we? That we can't find a place of balance without that.
Can't is a strong word for me, Congressman. I mean, there are countries there are functioning economies with fairly high standards of living that have government programs much more expansive than ours and tax burdens that are higher. They give something up through having made that set of choices. But I don't want to presume, as the chairman noted, it's not my place to invoke my policy preferences. That's for you and your colleagues.
Sure. All right. Very, very good. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Congressman.
Chairman Ryan.
Ms. Bass.
Thank you. You might have addressed this while I was running to another hearing, but just in case you didn't, if you could talk about the implication with the states, especially if we don't raise the debt ceiling, what is the forecast as to what would happen there? And then how would the states, be able to meet their obligations? Would we still be able to send states monies? How would we be able to deal with that?
So if the debt ceiling is not raised before the government runs out of money, then not all of the government's obligations would get paid. And it would, I don't know which ones might or might not get paid.
You don't know how it would be prioritized?
I don't know how it would be prioritized. Naturally, whoever it is who would not be receiving the checks they would otherwise be receiving will feel that effect. And that could be bondholders, it could be state and local governments, it could be households waiting for benefits depending on what checks go out and what checks don't. And for all the people who are waiting, it will be a burden, and for some governments or businesses or people, perhaps an unsupportable problem. But it's hard for us to analyze that, not knowing what the priorities would be, and also not ever having seen this event occur in modern U.S. history.
Well, in terms of the cuts, and knowing that we do have to cut back spending, and knowing that we also have to figure out what we do with the raising the debt ceiling, where are ways that we can cut that won't hurt the economy and especially hurt jobs?
So I think, Congresswoman, there aren't a lot of easy ways to do this, or you and your colleagues who worry about the rising debt would have done those things already. I think from an economic point of view, what is beneficial for the economy is lower debt accumulation over time. And what can be beneficial now is greater confidence that policies are being changed in ways that will reduce the growth and level of debt. At the same time, cutting back spending now, raising taxes now, will by itself, as I've said in response to a number of questions, tend to slow the economy. So you and your colleagues face a difficult trade-off there, and that is one of the major problems that we and others have discussed in connection with rising debt, is that it reduces the flexibility that you have to make policy adjustments you want. Countries that end up in fiscal crises, have to make often very stark changes in spending and revenues, often under bad economic circumstances. And early action by you and your colleagues can help to forestall that possibility in this country. But again, the immediate direct effect of cuts in spending or increases in taxes would be to slow the economy in our estimation.
Thank you.
Ms. Kester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Director Elmendorf. You can see policymakers and budget writers have a real balancing act. We have a real balancing act on our hands, and I think both sides of the aisle agree that we have to have a very bold plan on reducing the debt and deficit. We agree that government must live within its means. Then on the other hand, I think we all agree that we've got to continue to foster job growth. And when you look at the public surveys, any public survey from across the country, job growth and jobs continues to be the number one priority of the American people. It certainly is in my home state of Florida, in my community where we still have a double-digit unemployment rate. So I appreciate your expert analysis and guidance on how we walk that tightrope and effect the balancing act. But it appears that a consensus is building for our way forward here. And I want to see if you agree with some of the statements that have been made by a number of groups that have studied the issue of debt reduction and job creation as well. The President's Bipartisan Fiscal Commission has recommended that when we're developing our debt reduction plan, that budget cuts should start gradually so they don't interfere with the ongoing economic recovery, because growth is essential to restoring fiscal strength and balance. Do you agree with that general approach?
So Congressman, we, as you know, we don't make recommendations. So sentences that involve the word should are sentences that we stay away from for good reason. As you say, you and your colleagues face a trade-off here. That delay in changing the path of fiscal policy has a collection of very serious negative consequences for the economy. At the same time, sharp changes in policy, as I said in my opening remarks, could be disruptive, and there is a case for giving households and businesses and state and local governments time to plan and adjust. And those sets of ideas are in some conflict, that they push desirable policy in different directions, and we're just not positioned to judge those trade-offs. I think one thing to emphasize, though, is that I don't think there's much of a case for delaying the enactment of policy changes.
We've got to get started.
Is the actual collection of more revenue or reduction in spending. Enactment of changes doesn't cause a near-term contractionary effect, and can be supportive of spending if households and businesses gain confidence in seeing the federal budget on a more sustainable trajectory. There's really no case that I know of, an economic case, for waiting for you and your colleagues to make decisions. There is an economic case with trade-offs for the pace at which those decisions affect policy.
I think we agree. I think we often too often in Washington we focus on where we differ, but I think there is great consensus building that we've got to act now. We've got to focus on debt reduction and job creation, and we're going to have this very robust debate about how we get there. Now, yesterday, Chairman Bernanke said the largest drivers of the debt and deficit are health care costs of government and the aging population. Do you agree with that?
Yes, that's right.
Well, what I hope is that we're starting to see some appropriations cuts coming out from the other side, and I would just caution my colleagues that if the biggest drivers of the debt and deficit are health care costs of government and the aging population, some of the cuts that I'm seeing come out from the Appropriations Committee are not targeted towards the real drivers of the debt and deficit. And we've got to work together to get to that point where we're tackling the real problem and not harming job growth. Another well-known economist has recommended to us that you can't do it all right up front. You can't, that it really would push unemployment back to double digits if you tried to have trillion-dollar cuts in your first 2 years, when you're really, the better approach is to have a long-term deficit and debt reduction plan. What's your opinion on that?
Again, I think from an economic perspective, the crucial factor for building confidence among American households and businesses and among purchasers of our debt is to have a plan in place, to have a set of policies enacted by the Congress and signed by the President that put the country on a sustainable fiscal trajectory. So I can come up with a report like this that doesn't show debt rising relative to GDP as far as the eye can see. And the pace at which those changes are put in place in terms of the unfolding of the policies involves this more complicated trade-off.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for spending your morning with us. We appreciate it. We look forward to many more times with you. So thank you. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.